Okay, welcome to this Memory Palace on an Inspector Calls, just to kind of explain what we mean by the Memory Palace technique. First off, Memory Palace technique is simply a way of breaking down key information, like quotations, in your mind into a kind of series or order that you can easily recall in a situation like an exam, where obviously with text like an Inspector Calls you don't get an extract and you don't get the text in the exam. So being able to recall and remember key quotations is going to be quite an important skill. So what you do is you imagine a series of rooms in a house, a series of locations, and in each room there is an image which triggers a quote. So this is not the only useful memory technique for remembering quotes. Indeed, it might not be the best method for everybody, but certainly from my experience there are a wide range of students that really benefit from this technique. So the following Memory Palace is for quotations from the play An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley, which is in the AQA Literature Paper 2 exam. And it's section A of that exam. Okay, so I will talk you through the quotations and the images and the rooms. So in this An Inspector Calls Memory Palace, you arrive at the front door and you see a rather strange set of traffic lights right by the front door of this house, this Memory Palace. And they are flickering from soft pink to bright white. Okay. That image is meant to trigger a really important stage direction from Act 1, the opening stage directions, where Priestley says the lighting will change from pink and intimate during the engagement party with Sheila and Gerald's engagement, and it will then get brighter and harder once the inspector arrives. So it's a specific stage direction about lighting to suggest what a serious impact the inspector has on the, I suppose, atmosphere of the Burling household, the fact that he forces them to confront, sort of stark reality, and the truth about the way that working class people like Eva Smith suffer in society whilst they enjoy themselves and think about themselves a lot. So it's a very important opening stage direction to remember, and it engages with dramatic technique of lighting, which will please the examiners if you can talk about lighting as well as dialogue. Once we go past these traffic lights, then we go open the door and we go into the main hall, and there is an enormous engagement ring being held up by a young woman who is beaming. She's smiling, she looks ecstatic, and there's this huge engagement ring she's holding. It's sparkling, an expensive jewel like a diamond in it. This relates to a stage direction and a piece of dialogue from Act 1, which Sheila says. She says, excited, "Oh Gerald, is it the one you wanted?" And it's a piece of dialogue which reveals not only Sheila's naivety, idea that jewellery and marriage are going to make her happy in life and they have meaning. Not to say that marriage doesn't have any meaning, but it does show her naivety because Gerald has obviously been unfaithful to her and she doesn't really realise. She's very excited, but it also suggests Gerald's power in the relationship. He chose the ring he wanted for her. She didn't get to choose the ring. So there's a subtle sense that Gerald is the one who has much more power in the relationship, which would have been the norm perhaps in Edwardian England when the play was set. Even though by the time Priestley is writing, things have changed perhaps. Once we go past this massive engagement ring, we go into the sitting room, and there on the coffee table is a model of a sinking ship, and this obviously relates to a piece of dialogue which uses dramatic irony in Act 1 from Mr. Burling, where he says the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. This play is set in 1912. The Titanic sinks literally a week after the play is set, or a couple of weeks after the play is set. So obviously an audience in 1945 and an audience today would be sniggering really at Mr. Burling and viewing him as pompous and overconfident and perhaps not as clever as he thinks he is. So it's a clever technique by Priestley to suggest that Mr. Burling is not as intelligent as he thinks he is. As we go into the kitchen, there is a woman doing the washing up. There's loads of dishes there, they're all dirty, and she's scrubbing away. I suppose it could be Edna from the play. This relates to a piece of dialogue that Sheila says, and she says, "But these girls aren't cheap labour, they are people." And she says that following the revelations that Mr. Burling, her father, and indeed Gerald sort of see young women who work in factories as disposable, really. If they cause any problems, then Mr. Burling sacks them, and Gerald agrees. You can't give these people what they want. So it's a piece of dialogue that shows that Sheila has some sympathy for the working classes, even though she herself was quite cruel to Eva Smith as well. She starts to admit and engage with the idea that perhaps inequality is a bad thing in society. As we go up the stairs, there's just lots of penny coins scattered about on the steps, and you have to kind of step over them, careful you don't slip on them, and they make a kind of scraping sound as you tread on them. This relates to a piece of dialogue the inspector says when he's talked in Act 2. We've learnt a bit more about Eva Smith's fate and suffering of her experience as a working class woman, and this relates to him saying, I think we should often think about these young women counting their pennies in dingy back rooms, or it might be back bedrooms. I might have got that slightly wrong, but the idea of counting their pennies in a dingy room is quite an emotive image, really, when it's contrasted with the Burlings' dinner party. Their cigars and their brandy and their lovely food and their wealth, and they own factories and they're making profits, and they don't really think about these women that literally, and men that literally, have to count pennies in order to survive. Indeed, people like Gerald took advantage of that, didn't he, when he put Daisy Renton, Eva Smith, up in a set of rooms and used her. So as we go past over these pennies up the stairs, we get to the first bedroom at the top of the stairs, and there's a big "keep out" sign with a red line through a pregnant woman. What's that got to do with the play? Well, in Act 2, once we've had the revelations about Gerald, we then get Mrs. Burling confronted by the inspector, and the inspector says to her, after he forces her to admit that she turned Daisy Renton away because she didn't believe her story, she wouldn't give her any money from her charity, he says to her, "You've had children, yet you slammed the door in her face." Again, it's a very emotive and aggressive statement about the treatment that Daisy Renton suffered from people like Mrs. Burling, who just didn't believe women of that class deserved support and help, particularly if she saw them as dishonest, which she seems to view Daisy Renton as being. We know, obviously, that her son Eric is far more dishonest than Daisy Renton. So it's an aggressive attack, really, on Mrs. Burling. The idea that she as a woman could slam the door in a woman's face who is pregnant, who is vulnerable. Once we go from the bedroom, we don't go into the bedroom because there's that sign saying "keep out." We go to the bathroom, and written on the bathroom mirror is just the word "guilt." And that links to something the inspector says before he leaves. Actually, he leaves in Act 3, but the dialogue the inspector says in Act 2, if there's nothing else, we'll have to share our guilt. He's really promoting the idea of socialism and the idea that people should not be able to just go through their lives not thinking about those people beneath them who suffer. So if we have guilt, then perhaps we'll try and change our behaviour. It's quite a religious message, a Christian message, isn't it? As well as a political one. And I think you can see the inspector as a religious figure, perhaps, as well as a political figure. It's possible reading. But it's this idea that the Burlings should not be able to just carry on their lives not caring or understanding or feeling sympathy for those who suffer beneath them in terms of social class. Once we get up to the attic, there's actually a fire in the attic which is burning, obviously quite dangerous in the attic. It's very hot and it's very bright, flames curling about in that attic space. And this links to a line of dialogue that the inspector says, I think in Act 2, but Sheila repeats his dialogue. And it is fire and blood and anguish. And this is what the inspector warns the Burling will happen if they ignore his message. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he could mean that people will revolt against the upper classes. They'll start smashing things, breaking things, burning down buildings and institutions because of their mistreatment at the hands of their superiors or those higher up in the social hierarchy. It could actually also symbolise the Second World War and the First World War, indeed. So the play is set in 1912. It could point out that if equality is not reached in society, then you have wars, you have conflict, and you have the First World War and the Second World War. You may have revolution as well. So it's a very disturbing image, really, almost of biblical Old Testament proportions, to suggest that disaster will come if society does not change. So it's a stark warning. Once we get up on the roof, there is a big telephone ringing and a rather shocked and worried man standing there. I think it's Beaker from the Muppets. That links to a stage direction, and it describes Mr. Burling right at the end of the play. And why I've put this quote in is that it will force you to think about how, and remember really how the play actually ends. And the play ends with Mr. Burling putting the telephone down, having learnt that the inspector is on his way, and he looks in a panic-stricken fashion at the rest of the family. So there's a real sense of fear and a sense of terror, really, for the Burlings right at the end of the play, even though they figured out the inspector might have been fake, and that perhaps what he said was not 100% true. They're suddenly forced to feel very scared and worried again right at the end of the play. And I think this is Priestley saying, I don't want people to, no pun intended, feel they've got off the hook. He wants to create a sense of unease for the audience, as well as the characters, to suggest that we need to be worried about how society is going. If we're complacent, if we don't care, then disasters will happen. And I think he's saying to his audience in 1945, we don't want another war, a third world war after the Second World War. It will destroy society, and we need to be worried about it. We need to change things. Indeed, he was very progressive in starting up things like the NHS with the post-war Labour government, and that idea that you needed to support the vulnerable in society, otherwise society really collapses. So, the idea is you don't simply listen to this video and go, okay, yeah, I've revised those quotes. You walk yourself mentally through this house, remembering those images, and then trying to recall the quotes. And it needs to be practiced, and practiced regularly. But for me, it's one way of breaking down the whole play, into a series of quotes that I think, on the whole, although they might not work for a character question, for most themes that come up, these quotes will give you a range of things to talk about in terms of Priestley's technique and the ideas that he presents in the play, and indeed the structure of the play. So, I mean, I'll give you an example of that now. Here's some themes that you might get in a question. So it might be, how is social class presented in the play? How is inequality presented in the play? Poverty, socialism, capitalism. I think you can talk about pretty much all of these quotes in relation to that. For instance, social class, well, the first quote you could link to social class because it suggests the pink and intimate sort of atmosphere at the start of the play is broken down and destabilised by the inspector's entrance, where the lighting becomes brighter and harder because he forces the higher class characters to think about the working class characters. So their sense of security and comfort and luxury is broken down, and they are forced to feel, as we can see at the end of the play, rather more nervous about their position in society. So you could even link that opening quote. Oh, Gerald, is it the one you wanted? Well, again, that expensive engagement ring suggests the privilege of the Burling family and the Crofts and what they can afford in society, which contrasts with characters like Edna and obviously Daisy Rent and Eva Smith. If I think about dramatic irony, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, it suggests the pomposity of the upper classes who think they know everything, but as we know, because Titanic sank, they don't. So there may be a sense that social class is linked to that quote. I mean, I think you can do it with each theme. Inequality. But these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. It suggests Sheila starts to realise the inequality that occurs in society between the social classes. The inspector says counting their pennies. Well, surely, it's easy to link to inequality. Some people have to count their pennies, have nothing, whereas the Burlings drink brandy and smoke cigars. You've had children, you slam the door in her face. Again, inequality, that sense of somebody who's vulnerable is pushed away and turned away because of their social class, because of prejudices against their social class. So it's not fair. Sheila is supported and helped in society, whereas women like Daisy Renton are not. Socialism, all of these quotes link to socialism in some way. If I go back to the stage directions, how is that linked to socialism? Well, socialism is, forces a brighter and harder view of what society is really like. It's only pink and intimate and soft and luxurious for a minority, and socialism forces us to acknowledge that everybody counts in society. How does socialism link to Sheila's quote, excited? Is it the one you wanted for me? Well, the idea that socialism is about sharing wealth equally. So again, we have this image of a very wealthy, rich, privileged few who can afford expensive engagement rings and parties, etc. And Priestley is saying this is not fair. Other people like Edna and Daisy Renton don't have these luxuries in society. Why does Gerald not marry Daisy Renton? Because she's not of the right social class, and therefore he casts her aside. That is not an equal view of society, is it? So for me, all of these quotes can be bent to pretty much any theme, and therefore they're quite a good way of remembering key quotations.